So in this video, I'm going to do an example of making a contingency table in Excel. The data I'm going to be using is the sample data for 1,000 pregnancies stored in this file here. And the contingency table is going to cross-tabulate Indigenous status and smoking status. Remember that a contingency table is looking at two variables against each other. So jumping over to our spreadsheet, the two that we were interested in are smoking status, so I'll highlight this column, and then Indigenous status, so I'll highlight this column. Now I might rename this, this one here, Indigenous status, just to make it clear that it's the Indigenous status, since the column maybe wasn't so descriptive as it could have been. So in order to do this, what we want to do is insert a pivot table. It's going to be the easiest way to add up how many people sit in the category of smoker or non-smoker, so yes or no, and then the categories of Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So pick any cell within your data set, and if you go to Insert and then Pivot Table, it should bring up this dialog box. It automatically should default to correctly selecting the data set. So we want the first cell that we've got data in all the way to the very bottom. Mine has defaulted to it, so I'll leave it as it is. And then I'm going to insert this into a new worksheet. So hit OK, and the pivot table will pop up. So now we just need to tell Excel what data we want to display in the pivot table. And of course our contingency table needs a set of data for the rows, a set of data for the columns, and then inside the table it's going to add up how many occurrences are there for each of the different combinations. So I'm going to start with picking the smoking status or smoker status, and I'm going to drop that into the rows of my table. And then our other one of interest was Indigenous status, so I'm going to drop that into columns. So now you should be able to see here the rows here are corresponding to smoker, so yes or no, and the columns here are corresponding to the Indigenous status, so yes you're Indigenous or yes you're non-Indigenous. So the other thing we need is values inside our table, which we don't quite have at the moment. So we want to count up how many people fit into each of these different categories. So it doesn't matter which one you pick, so if I say pick smoker and stick it in values here, it's going to default to count, which is what we want. It's counting how many fit into those different categories. And that's what's filled out here. So at the moment, for a non-smoker and Indigenous, there's 23. For a smoker who's Indigenous, there's 27. For a non-smoker who's non-Indigenous, there's 587 of those people. And for smokers which are non-Indigenous, there's 363 of them. So at the moment, I dragged in smoker. You could have equally dragged in Indigenous status down here, and it should bring up the same values inside your table. So the only other thing to do is probably to make this look a little bit nicer. So rather than calling this row labels, you might want to call it, say, smoker status, so smoker and non-smoker, and then rather than column labels, you might want to call this Indigenous status. And then you have Indigenous and non-Indigenous. These are just totaling each of the different ones. So the total of non-smoker is 23 plus 587, and that should be 610. And then same thing for the columns, the total down here. This is the grand total of everything, which was 1,000 pregnancies. So that's all there is for this video in terms of creating your contingency table. See you in another video.